So if we think about flowers for a minute, if you've ever, we talked the other day about gardens and stuff, but a lot of you had a garden, but you ever notice you see flowers growing is they sort of go through stages in which they mature over time. And that's what these pictures kind of show you. When a flower first starts to grow, it's kind of closed up. Okay? And it's sort of sealed up with these green leaves. What are those green leaves? They have a name for them. Yeah? Yeah, those are the sepals. Okay? And they're protecting the flower sort of as it grows and as it's starting to develop. Okay? And then as time goes on, and the timing of this is dictated by sort of the weather, the amount of sunlight, the temperature, because it's important that the flowers open at the right time of the year. So the sepals protect that flower as it's growing and developing. Then as it opens, the petals become exposed. Petals are, their purpose is to attract pollinators. We'll talk a lot about pollinators today, to the flowers, to sort of advertise where the pollinators should go. And then as the flower fully opens, it exposes the male and female reproductive structures, the stamens and the pistil, so that pollination can happen. So if we look real close at a tulip, a flower you would see in the springtime, probably growing around your house, people plant them. If we look closely we have obviously the petals, and then we have the reproductive structures in the middle. So what are these 6 things around the outside, Ethan?
Anthers.
Yeah, those are the anthers. Each one is a stamen, and what you're looking at are the anthers. And you can see they're kind of like have a powdery texture. What is that powdery stuff on each one? That's the pollen. Those are tiny little pollen grains. Each tiny little pollen grain is a reproductive cell. It's a male gamete, you would say, a sex cell. Then in the center of the flower, the reproductive parts, what would this be? Yeah, this is the stigma. The whole thing would be the pistil. Really, we only see the stigma here. This is sort of where pollen grains would land to pollinate this specific flower. Jenna?
I have a question.
Yep.
How does it have both types of cells without accidentally mixing it?
We're going to talk about that in a minute. So great question, and I'll answer that eventually. So what Jenna's asking is, well, isn't this pollen just going to fall on the stigma and then pollinate like the same flower? Sometimes that happens, but there are ways plants have of avoiding that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Grace?
Why does it smell good?
We'll talk about that today as well. Why do flowers smell good? Not all flowers smell nice. Some smell like rotting flesh. Some smell like dung, like manure. Some smell nice. Some don't smell at all. And we'll think about that today. So yes, we have the stamens on the outside. We have the pistil in the middle. Here's a different type of flower. This is a lily. It's sort of a side view, so you see things a little differently. What are these brownish things? Those are the anthers. These are the stamen. This one has 6 stamens. And then this green part here, that's what? This is the stigma up here. That's the what? Style. The whole thing is the pistil. You can't see the ovary at the bottom. But yeah, same sort of thing. Okay. Now, these male anthers, they mature over time kind of like the flower does. They only start producing pollen at a certain time. And that's one way plants have of regulating whether or not they self-fertilize. So when we say a flower's been pollinated, what we're talking about is this process when pollen from the male parts of the flower, the anther, is transferred to the stigma of the plant, of a plant. Now it has to be the same species. Pollen grain from a pine tree cannot pollinate a rose flower. Has to be the same species, just like in reproduction in animals, has to be the same species. And what Jenna was asking about was something called self-pollination. Okay. So we have the anther and the stigma, and pollen from this anther could land on this stigma and pollinate this flower, but that sort of takes away the advantage of sexual reproduction. Because in sexual reproduction, we have the mixing of traits. But if we self-pollinate, that doesn't have any new genetic material coming in. Okay. So that's what self-pollination is. When pollen from a plant fertilizes the same plant. And most plants avoid doing that in certain ways. The other more beneficial way for the species is cross-pollination. When pollen from one plant pollinates a completely different plant. So you have two separate individuals. When pollination does happen, when a pollen grain lands on this stigma, it grows like a little tube down through the style into the ovary, and then a tiny little sperm cell from within the pollen grain travels down that tube into the ovary and fertilizes an ovule. And then that fertilized ovule can grow into a new plant.
Do you want us to draw the arrows?
No, it doesn't. You can just really go however you want. So, cross-pollination is important. And as I said, most plants
Yeah.
have adaptations that make cross-pollination more likely. And it's important because it produces variation for the species. At the bottom,
Yeah.
that's where fertilization is, in the ovary. So cross-pollination produces variation for the species. And variation is important if you think back to when we talked about natural selection. You remember natural selection had 4 steps. What does it start with? In order for natural selection to work in a species, you have to have something first. Before that, but which, you need something else before that.
Wait, are we going like way down or like,
The first thing.
a male and a female?
Well, we'll get to that in a second. It takes variation, right? You have to have differences between individuals in order for natural selection to work. Then we have a struggle for survival in nature because of limited resources, because of predators. Which organisms survive in natural selection? Which ones survive, Rihanna? The fittest. What does fit mean? Not necessarily
Best
strong,
adapted.
the best adapted. And if they can survive, that means they can do what? Reproduce. And they pass on these good variations to the next generation. And we call those adaptations. So it's important to have lots of variation in the species because that's what natural selection uses to determine which will survive and which don't. And so sexual reproduction is important because it produces that variation. But if a plant self-pollinates, it's really not very helpful because it's the same individual. You're not mixing genetic material from 2 separate individuals.
Question, scientifically, I mean, the reason, was like, this, what we just said, and survival of this and everything, is that the reason why humans evolved to be smarter?
Being smarter conveys certain advantages, definitely, to survival. So partially, yeah. All right, so how do plants avoid self-pollination? There's a couple ways. One is in the timing of how the different parts of the flower mature. That usually in plants, the anther, which matures and starts producing pollen, might mature before the stigma is ready. And therefore, pollen grains from the same flower can't pollinate the same flower. They have to move to a different flower where the stigma is mature. Other types of plants have what's called imperfect flowers, like cucumbers, for example, and squash and grass. The flowers in those plants don't have male and female parts in the same flower. Okay? When a plant does have them, both, it's called a perfect flower. It has male parts and female parts. But there are some plants that have imperfect flowers. This one only has what? Yeah, only the pistil. It doesn't have any stamen in this specific flower. This one has only the male parts, only the stamen. There are even some plants, some trees for example, the whole tree only has male flowers. And then a whole separate individual tree has only female flowers. Okay? So some trees are actually male and some trees are female. Other trees differ, depends on the type of tree. The other way plants have of reducing self-pollination is that the stigma and the pollen from the same plant are incompatible with each other. And if the pollen lands on the stigma, it won't actually start to grow that pollen tube and won't fertilize the cell. So cross-pollination is what is preferred for the species. Because it increases variation, increases the likelihood of survival. All right, well, how does pollen get from plant to plant? There's two sort of main ways. One is by wind pollination. So wind pollination is when basically wind currents blowing pick up pollen from the flowers. It blows all over the place, and sometimes some of it happens to land on the stigma of another flower. That's wind pollination. You can see this picture, you can see this is the pollen. When you go out in the springtime, your driveway is covered with that green pollen, that's from wind pollinated trees usually. They have to produce a lot of pollen because it's just kind of randomly blowing around. And so you need a lot of pollen to hopefully get some of it onto the stigma of another flower. And also the flowers are different. In a wind-pollinated plant, usually the petals are really small because they don't need to be big. They're not attracting any animals. It's better for them to be small so that the wind can hit those anthers. The anthers are usually long and exposed, so again, the wind can hit them. The stigma usually has little extensions that kind of catch the pollen as it's blowing through the air. So that's wind pollination. Jenna?
Question, do tree seeds also need to do this?
Trees have flowers, yep.
Like, do they need to go through this and start growing?
Yep, to produce seeds, this needs to happen, pollination. Another major way that pollination happens is through animals. So probably the biggest thing that you would recognize, something that pollinates flowers, is what? A bee. Most people think of bees. And bees are very important pollinators. In fact, we'll talk about that when we get to the food. Yeah, insects are very common pollinators. Bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, all of those act as pollinators. Birds are pretty frequently pollinators as well, like a hummingbird. Sometimes even mammals, like bats or mice, can be pollinators, and even amphibians and reptiles once in a while. So many types of animals act as pollinators. So, why do animals visit flowers? Do they just do it to be nice so they can pollinate them? Okay, I'm going to help you out pollinate the flowers. Grace? They do it usually to get food. What is the food typically stored in flowers that animals are using? Okay?
Like the sugars.
Yeah, it's called nectar. Okay? Most flowers that are pollinated by animals produce nectar inside of the flower. And that nectar is a sort of sugary solution that the animal uses for energy. So it's providing a food source. And that's why bees visit flowers, right? Or hummingbirds visit flowers to get that nectar. And pretty interesting is that the flowers match their pollinators extremely well. For example, flowers that are pollinated by hummingbirds have a lot of nectar usually that's very sweet because hummingbirds need a lot of energy. Whereas insect-pollinated flowers probably have less nectar, with less sugar, because insects don't need as much energy. Also, some animals actually eat the pollen itself. It's high in protein. Okay? Some bees eat it. Beetles can eat that pollen itself, and that's their food source. And so animals visit the flowers to get nectar, but then that's not pollen. So how do they actually pollinate the flowers? Bailey? Yeah, exactly. So as animals visit flowers getting nectar, they get pollen on them. Because the anthers are right next to where they get the nectar, they get pollen on them like this bat. This bat is covered in pollen. When this bat goes to feed in another flower, some of these pollen grains are going to fall off of it, land on the stigma of that next flower, and then it will have pollinated that flower. Now this is kind of an extreme example, but the same thing in bees. When bees, I'll show you a picture in a minute, visit flowers, they get pollen all over them. And then as they go flower to flower, they're helping to spread that pollen from one plant to another. Most plants advertise to animals that they have nectar in a couple ways. One way is with colors. Flowers are brightly colored. Usually brightly colored flowers are pollinated by animals, okay, because animals can see in color. And different types of animals see differently. Bees, for example, see blue and yellow and ultraviolet, which we cannot perceive. So if you see flowers that are blue or yellow, it's likely they're pollinated by bees. Birds see red well, and so red flowers are often pollinated by birds. If anyone at your house, does anyone have a hummingbird feeder? What color is it?
Red.
It's red, because that's what's attractive to hummingbird. And what do you put in it?
Like, it's like syrup.
That super sugary syrup. Yep, that's because hummingbirds need a lot of energy. They're working very hard to hover in the air, and that's why those feeders attract hummingbirds. Ethan?
If bees see blue and yellow, why does it like, wouldn't they just see yellow like us as well? What was it says they see yellow?
Yeah, they can see those colors better than, say, green or orange or red. And also, this shows that even a flower that just looks plain yellow to us has ultraviolet markings on it that bees can actually see. So it has like a little target in the middle that bees can see, knowing where to go. Bats, however, don't see very well, and they are usually active at night, so the flowers pollinated by bats are usually just white in color, so they're easier to see at night. There are designs on flowers that guide animals into where the nectar is located. And there are smells, aromas, this says, that attract animals. So here's an example of a bee. This bee has pollen all over it. Okay? Bees generally feed on nectar. They also eat the pollen. They use some of the nectar to survive, but they take in more than they actually need, and where do they bring it?
To their hive.
Back to their hive, where they then spit it up, regurgitate it into little cells of wax. They beat their wings near it, which evaporates some of the water, and that nectar turns into honey.
Wait, so is that how they get beeswax?
Yeah, the wax comes from the hive. The honey comes from bees. If you eat honey in your tea this morning or on your toast, that honey eventually was nectar in a flower, which a bee, or thousands of bees,
So we're just eating.
consumed, regurgitated into their hive.
I have a beeswax chapstick. We're eating beeswax.
Yeah, basically. All right, Ethan.
My mom has a beehive at her house, and she saved some of the wax, because they used to, like, this was actually an old thing that they used to do in like the 1940s, but they used to use it to break a gum.
Oh yeah.
Bee wax,
Yeah.
so like you can actually chew on it and
Yep.
stuff.
Yeah, you could buy honey like in the comb with the wax and you just chew it up. It's really good actually. And yeah, you could keep bees. You know, if you ever been driving down the highway or the road, you might see it looks like a dresser drawers. It's like of different colors out on the side of a hill just outside. Those are beehives. People keep the bees stay in those drawers and they could bring them from place to place. We'll talk more about that when we get to fruit. So yeah, bees store up the nectar, regurgitates it to form honey. And flowers that bees pollinate often have these markings that show the bees sort of where to go to get that nectar. Yeah, this yellow flower looks like this if you were to look at ultraviolet. So again, here are some more examples of that. These flowers that just kind of look yellow, if you were to look at them and you could perceive ultraviolet, they would look like bees, pictures, guiding the bees into the hive. We'll watch this eventually, not right now. One more slide I wanted to.
We have like a
Oh,
minute
no,
left.
you don't have this slide, I just want to talk about it. Butterflies and moths have this mouth part called the proboscis. It's this long curled up thing here, this long thing. And so that can reach down into flowers that are very deep and
Mosquitoes have that?
reach the nectar, yes. And so insects or flowers that are pollinated by moths and butterflies usually have really long shape to them. Moth pollinated flowers are white or pale. They usually have a strong odor. Flies and bees, what are flies attracted to?
Food.
Rotting smells, waste, dung. What do you think flowers pollinated by flies smell like? Not very good. Poop. Yes. Rotting flesh.
Yeah.
What?
I don't know what rotten flesh smells like.
Because if you ever were on the road walking by and there's like a dead animal in the road and you have a nasty smell. Not like a skunk, like a dead animal. Worse. Birds pollinate. Birds have a good sense of color. So usually bird pollinated flowers are colorful. Birds do not have a strong sense of smell. So usually bird pollinated flowers don't have a strong aroma to them. And they provide nectar in greater quantities because birds need more energy to survive. Even mammals, like mice and bats, can pollinate flowers. Okay. All right, so this is our last slide to summarize. The adaptations for wind pollination versus animal pollination. So in animal pollinated flowers, what are the petals like? Brightly colored? Big? What about the aroma?
I was about to say, it smells good.
Smells good, usually a scented aroma. Do they contain nectar? Yeah, because they're trying to attract animals. Do they need a lot of pollen or a little pollen?
I'm a little.
Little, compared to the wind pollinated flowers. Wind pollinated flowers, how about their petals? Very small, usually not colorful. Aroma? No. Because they're not adapted to attract the animals, they're adapted to just blowing through the wind. Do they contain nectar?
Yes.
I hear both answers. What do you think? Because it's not an advantage for them to produce nectar, right? Because it would just be costing them energy. How much pollen? A lot. They produce huge amounts of pollen.
We need our homework.
Yes, you need your homework.
Sophia!
She wants that 5 out of 5 tomorrow. I would have remembered.
I heard like 5 people shout her name all at once.
I paid her $5 to say that.
We went all the way down the hallway and then he
So it's a very short, very small, just about pollination. Make sure it gets done for tomorrow, those of you that didn't have your homework done today. And make sure I get my sign finishing back. That's
Since when do we have homework?
since today. New Year's resolution, more homework for 7th graders.
Wait, do we have homework tomorrow?
I'll even make you guys today's video.